This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
So while you're all locked up with a little quarantine, waiting for my newest episode, which of course is always coming next, apparently I've become quite systematic at this. But while you wait, 3 things I want to talk about today: the deep state, the flow state, and animal weapons. Can these 3 episodes help you to make money? I think they can. Will some people think these 3 episodes can't help you to make money? I'm sure. I've got a lot of crazy people that listen. They love to hate me. Can you listen to these 3 episodes with no inclination about making money at all, but just want to learn and enjoy? Damn straight, I hope you can. No long setup. As I said, it's quarantine time. You're locked in the house. You got to eat Tide balls every day. You're taking Lysol showers, Clorox enemas. You're snorting hand sanitizer. I mean, it's fucking crazy right now. So with all that said, and a little piss and vinegar from me, let's jump right into the deep state, the flow state, and animal weapons. My guest today is Mike Lofgren. Today we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to me, which is trying to break apart American politics. Mike's book, his new book, is titled The Deep State: The Fall of the Constitution and the Rise of a Shadow Government. In a world where everyone thinks their vote matters, in a world where everyone thinks the next politician that gets elected will solve their particular problem and fix the country, Mike has a counter to that style of thinking, that, in my opinion, wrong style of thinking. There really is forces, concerns, organizations, corporations that are far more powerful than any of the nitwits we elect to go to Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Mike Lofgren. So Mike, even though I'm calling you from a communist country in Asia today, I actually own property in Vienna, Virginia. I grew up in Vienna, and I'm intimately aware of the Beltway scene. Gosh, if I think back to the 1980s, a place like Vienna would have had just typical 1950s, 60s split-level homes, a lot of government employees, but not a huge amount of wealth. And then, boom, we're now at a completely different situation. That's a little bit of the setup, so you know where I'm coming from, just on my background. To start with this, though, I want to read something from your work, The Deep State, which I really think sets this up nicely. This is from your work. By the end of my career, I considered myself a resolute nonpartisan and increasingly viewed all political ideologies as mental and emotional crutches or substitute religions. For leaders, a means of manipulating attitudes and behaviors. For the rank and file, a lazy surrogate for problem solving and a way of fulfilling the craving to belong to something bigger than oneself. That is a really fantastic couple of sentences. And it's like, I mean, anybody out there that still has a pulse in them probably wants to give you a hug for writing those sentences.
I think what it does is describe my own career path. I tried to view myself, certainly I was working within a party system in Congress. At the end of the day, I was a professional having to deal with federal budgets. The numbers were what the numbers were. You can't fake them. And these people who continuously, for 3 decades, pretended that tax cuts increase revenue when they do the opposite, or that our intervention in the Middle East will solve the problem when it only increases the problem. It creates a kind of hydra-headed mess. These people are no longer responding to reality and experience and empirical evidence. They're simply responding to an ideological fantasy, which is kind of indistinguishable from a fundamentalist religion.
Let's define things from the beginning so people have a feeling of your terminology. The deep state is what exactly? People
elected George W. Bush with certain expectations, and perhaps the more ideologically engaged of them saw him fulfill their expectations of tax cuts and unilateral military power. Of course, it got us into a mess, and there was a lot of rethinking. So we elected Barack Obama on the promise of hope and change. Yet this candidate who campaigned against the surge in Iraq, against illegal surveillance, against most of the policies that Bush had instituted, ended up continuing many of them. His Secretary of Defense, arguably the most important cabinet member in his government, was Bob Gates, precisely an old Bush family consigliere who presided over the surge in Iraq. John Brennan, a CIA official in the Bush administration, became CIA director under Barack Obama. Victoria Nuland, the infamous instigator of the hacked phone call in Kiev, who arguably was behind the coup in Kiev in 2014 that set us at loggerheads with Russia, was a foreign policy advisor of Dick Cheney. Now, how is it that two opposite people are formally running the government, yet the people they choose for sort of the permanent government are the same people? And you see this suffused throughout our governmental structure. It's the same Wall Street types, whether it's Tim Geithner or Hank Paulson as Secretary of the Treasury. They're essentially birds of a feather. I call this phenomenon the deep state, both for that and the fact that the governmental parts, particularly of the national security state and the finance portion of the government, are intimately connected with the military-industrial complex, Silicon Valley for surveillance, and of course Wall Street for financing and for careers.
And so the deep state, for people to start to wrap their arms around them, you position it as a shadow government, but it's not, as you say, you don't view it as a conspiracy theory. You look at this more as a gradual accumulation of power, prestige, whatnot, that started after World War II. Why don't you explain that a little bit, bringing us up to perhaps 9/11, post-World War II, up to 9/11, and kind of touch on the big targets of how things started to unfold?
Well, first of all, I'll reiterate that it's not a conspiracy. In fact, when you say something is a conspiracy, then it's pure death as far as getting it taken seriously. And it doesn't have to be. These are things that happen in the light of day. Most of the characters, their names are publicly accessible. Their goings-on are reported in the newspapers. There's simply a tremendous amount of continuity of people following what they perceive as their own interest, and they rationalize it as the national interest. It started probably, I would say, in World War II, where you had the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. This was the biggest, most expensive, and most secret project ever. They built entire cities from scratch, like Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. that nobody outside the workers knew about. Congress didn't know about it. Congress didn't know it was appropriating the money for it. President Truman, when he was vice president, had no clue about the bomb. He had to be briefed on it by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, the day after he became president. So this kind of set a baseline for secrecy and extravagance and projects that it was best the American public didn't know about. It set a tremendous precedent. Of course, these structures grew during the Cold War to the point where Eisenhower, who presided over it for 2 terms in his farewell address, warned us about the rise of disastrously misplaced power known as the military-industrial complex. Now, I would say the turmoil of the Vietnam War, the urban riots, the revelations about the CIA and the Church Committee in the late 60s and early 70s was a potential inflection point where we could have gotten control of the thing. But I think during the Reagan administration, the forces pushed back. We had things like Iran-Contra, which showed essentially a plot to subvert the Constitution. Nobody was seriously punished, and it's rolled forward ever since. After 9/11, it went on steroids. In the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, which I call Beltway land, since 9/11, I think we built the equivalent of 7 Pentagons in terms of square footage for national security purposes, whether it be the Pentagon, NSA, Homeland Security, etc., CIA, since 9/11.
True or false, Mike? Quick statement from me. Elections don't matter all the way down to the local town council level, from the president to Congress to state elections, gubernatorial, down to the town council level. Does it matter anymore?
It matters on the margin. I would say that Barack Obama is not George Bush, although his policies are very similar. I think we would be in up to our ears in Syria with major ground forces if we had Hillary Clinton elected in 2008 rather than Barack Obama. So yes, it matters on the margin, but the general vector of movement, the general vector of who gets what in our society, what the general distribution of income is, what our foreign policy looks like in general, is going to be pretty much the same. Now, I would say Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, respectively, are severely testing that thesis simply because income distribution has become so out of whack. People have become so tired of foreign policy and what they view as inequitable trade policy. If you look at free trade, every so-called responsible economist, usually from chairs endowed by big business at our universities, is going to say it's great. Well, they don't know any workers who've lost their job. They don't know the assembly line worker in Toledo. I think we may have reached an inflection point where there's broad consciousness. They can't necessarily connect the dots. They can't analyze it in an intellectual way, but the public knows something is wrong. The Trump and Sanders candidacies, however disparate they are, however they may or may not succeed, they have shaken up the political structure. They have certainly frightened the daylights out of what I call the permanent campaign finance military industrial complex. All these consultants, pollsters, gurus who made a fat living around the Beltway, just as defense contractors have, from the party systems because they have completely different business models for raising money. Sanders gets over 1 million contributions of $30 each, and Trump, by his own very modest estimation, is richer than God. So he doesn't need a lot of contributions from rich people. So I think what you're seeing with Hillary, what you're seeing with the Republican National Committee is the forces of the establishment pushing back very aggressively at what they see as a mortal threat to the status quo.
You know, you mentioned the Beltway land, the area where I think you live right now and where I grew up. I tell you, I always say that if I think it's like 5 or 6 of the top 10 wealthiest counties surround DC, and people, you tell that to people around America, they just kind of shake their head. They don't get it. It's just these government jobs are just amazing how much money they spend, the amount of money that circulates and comes from being either a contractor or working for the government, just flat out amazing. And the McMansions in that area, I think people just can't wrap their arms around it unless they see it. I want to go back to something you were talking about though. So if I look at something like the exploding national debt, you could see standards of living are not exactly going up. You talked about the decline of U.S. manufacturing. Retirement income, first we had 0 interest rates, and now we're about to go to negative interest rates. You know, the educational system. Do you trace all of this to the deep state?
My distinction is I'm not looking just at the military industrial complex. I'm not looking just at Wall Street the way Michael Lewis might look at it in The Big Short. I consider them integral parts of a bigger ecosystem. The same system that invaded Iraq is the same system that exploded our deficit, both through the tax cuts for the rich and the military expending. Notice in all our previous wars, we had income tax increases or tax surcharges or some way to finance the war. The invasion of Iraq was the first major war where George Bush, rather than asking for sacrifice, told citizens to go shopping, and then he gave them a tax cut which simply magnified the budget deficit. Now, one point I'd like to make is it's not actually the government workers who are living in the McMansions. They have capped salaries, and in fact, the government workforce is no bigger than it was at the time of John F. Kennedy, when we had little more than half the population in the country. So the per capita number of federal workers has actually gone down. Yet people say, well, where's all this spending coming from? It goes to contractors. There's no cap on their salaries. There's no limit to their profits. So the outsourcing of government contracts is primarily how people get rich. And of course, these people living out in Loudoun County sort of think of themselves as a kind of free Jeffersonian squirearchy living out there in the old former hunt country of Virginia. But hey, they're living off the government every bit as much as a government worker, and they're getting a lot richer.
Let me go into Wall Street. You worked for John Kasich?
I sure did.
Let me offer up a little quote here, which I think is interesting from your work. And so I guess years back after Kasich left Congress, he went to Lehman Brothers. I don't hear this much on CNN or anything these days, but he went to Lehman Brothers, took a job there. You quote a very flattering picture that he painted of Dick Fuld. Dick Fuld, who you can easily argue had a tremendous amount to do with what happened in the fall of 2008. And so as he took that job, he said, quote, Fuld is an awesome guy. He's the kind of guy you want to go to battle with. He's a great leader. I like people who are really smart and who are great leaders. That's an amazing quote. I mean, and this guy's actually got some people in the country interested in voting for him today. You would think that quote alone would tell somebody with a modicum of intelligence, what is this guy doing around? This guy is so full of it. Am I completely in the wrong direction?
For a little background for your listeners, Dick Fuld was the CEO of Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers collapse was the biggest corporate bankruptcy in world history, and it set off the September 2008 financial meltdown, the biggest global financial meltdown since the stock market crash of 1929. Fuld arguably was the worst guy on Wall Street in a whole menagerie of sociopaths. He was known as the gorilla, and he leveraged Lehman something like 40-1. He resisted attempts to deleverage or to sell out while the getting was good. You'll notice Hank Paulson took pretty good care of his buddies on Wall Street, Goldman and the other banks and AIG even. Hank Paulson, the Secretary of Treasury under Bush, but he left Lehman out in the cold, although there was a lot of bad feeling from Fuld that this was personal animus from Paulson. I can understand it, because if there was, only so much room in the lifeboat that the Treasury was providing, and somebody had to be left in the water for the sharks, that guy was going to be Fuld. Unlike Kasich, I don't think Fuld was an awesome guy.
Talk a little bit more about that. I mean, that's really remarkable. I mean, there's the way that people inside the deep state move, they move laterally back and forth from politics to corporate, from politics to banking. It's like a merry-go-round or a revolving door, a turnstile. It never stops. And then when they go back to being a politician, the whole thing of they're the man of the people again. I think you're right that with Trump and Sanders, the public might not understand all of the details, but they smell something is up. And Trump and Sanders might not be perfect messengers by any stretch, but they're giving people a chance to say, hey, this stuff doesn't smell right.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I think for years, decades, the strategy has been as these people have moved. And for instance, Jeb Bush, after he left the governorship of Florida, he became a consultant for Lehman Brothers, among others. So this is really common to sort of tie in the military-industrial complex with Wall Street. David Petraeus, after he left the CIA somewhat in disgrace for leaking code word level information to his mistress, ended up as a partner at Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, of Manhattan, a leveraged buyout firm. Now, I wasn't aware that being the greatest general, supposedly, since Alexander the Great, actually gave you qualifications in leveraged buyouts on Wall Street. But of course, the reason they hired the guy was as a door opener in Washington. What these people all count on is short memories by the public, and a public that's so turned off and apathetic that they don't really pay attention. And I'd have to say our commercial media, which in the last 30 years has gone down from about 50 or so major companies to around half a dozen, they have no interest in stirring any of this up. Their job is to sell Budweiser and cornflakes. And they do that by talking about Kim Kardashian or whether Tom Brady deflated a football or something like that. A complex story about where your money went, where the personnel went from the Hill to Wall Street, and then back to a governorship or a presidential candidate. That sort of complex follow the money thing takes a long attention span, and it takes good investigative reporting. And they're not going to provide that.
Mike, I thought you had a great example with Lindsey Graham, who I find one of the most, I used to like him when he was younger and in Congress. He seemed to have some kind of a spine, but he has become something older in age that is just, he seems to be part and parcel, like a deep state spokesman. I mean, it's like he might as well have a label on his chest that says deep state. I would love for you to talk about the example
with Sheldon Adelson, the internet gambling legislation, because I thought the connection with Graham was a really great story to give the people listening an insight as to how the sausage is made.
Lindsey Graham has been a federal elected official since about, I think, 1995, first in the House and now in the Senate. Suddenly in 2014, he introduces legislation to ban internet gambling. Now, who does this benefit? It benefits people who own casinos. Foremost among them, Sheldon Adelson, who in 2014 started showering money on elected officials, PAC money. Funny how the first time that Lindsey Graham receives money from Sheldon Adelson, he runs out and introduces a bill to ban internet gambling. Now, that seems almost like a quid pro quo, although I suppose Justice John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, would say it's not a strict quid pro quo. And Lindsey Graham would, of course, tell you, well, you know, his Baptist constituents in South Carolina, they think gambling is a sin. Well, that may be, but he was not driven to introduce such legislation for the previous almost 20 years until Sheldon Adelson started showering him with money.
But this is par for the course. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. And I think probably today what we can safely say is that it's reached levels and peaks that we've never seen. And I would love for you to also make the connection. I told you that I'm calling from Asia. I happen to be in a communist country, but as you know, there's plenty of communist countries in Asia that operate extremely capitalistic on the ground. And I think it would cause many Americans that have never been to kind of go, wow, they're really merchants. But the government structures for some of these countries, clearly there's no control by the people. There's no real voting. They're lucky, perhaps, if their leaders send them in the right direction. I wonder how you feel about that, connecting back to voting mattering or not. What's the difference? Like, I mean, how can we in America sit back and lament and say, well, look at the Chinese form of government. It's communist. The people don't have any control. And I look at what we've become in America, and I have a hard time, except for labels, I have a hard time understanding how we're truly different these days.
I'm not going to denigrate the fact that we do have a Bill of Rights. Sometimes it's honored in the breach more than the observance. If you look at the Fourth Amendment prohibition against illegal search and seizure vis-a-vis the National Security Agency, nevertheless, we do have protections that an independent or relatively independent court recognizes. Now, that said, these are legacies of the past. These are being eroded over time by the fact that what we have is a kind of oligarchy that's grown up that maintains the original form of the government we have with voting and elections, separation of powers, and so forth. But the choices we get tend to be Coke or Pepsi, because the way the oligarchs seem to have had it wired last year was it's going to be Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton. Now it's beginning to look like, yes, we'll get Hillary Clinton. Very hawkish, pro-Wall Street corporate Democrat. But that's typically how the oligarchy tries to manipulate the system. Yes, we can go to the polls. Yes, we can make differences on the margin, but it's not all that great. You have a certain measure of popular control in communist China. If the corruption of the local party oligarchs gets too great and the public gets roiled, then they take cognizance of it in Beijing and they hold their periodic campaigns to clean up corruption. But it's mostly a cosmetic operation.
Let's talk about the Fed for a few minutes. I look at what happened 2008, 2009. I see the QE policy from the Fed. I see extremely low interest rates, as I mentioned earlier, going negative soon. Was this all just a massive backdoor bailout for the banks and for the brokerage firms and whatnot? And do you see is that the Fed's clearly a part of the deep state as well, right?
Definitely the case. Now, if part of this is due to the fact that these people are all educated in the same schools in economics and business, they all have the same template for how to solve problems. They say to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They have a limited palette of things that they can do because they can't conceive of anything else. Now, obviously, we're going to have to engage in some sort of a rescue operation for the economy, and the Fed would play a significant role in that. Maybe they should have recapitalized the banks. In so doing, they should have replaced the ownership and the executives, because in getting the federal money, that should have been the deal. Anybody working in the bank at an executive capacity, there would be a salary cap. There'd be some mandatory measure to write down loans. So you wouldn't be just helping the banks. You'd be preventing foreclosures on Main Street, not just helping Wall Street. But the sort of policy recipe they came up with was sort of very predictable type of thing that just bailed out Wall Street, gave them impunity, very low interest rates that they could get money and arbitrage it and make money from money. So now they've recovered very quickly, whereas Main Street has not. Essentially, they were the lever that got Wall Street back on its feet.
Mike, why are there no whistleblowers? I mean, like I mentioned, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I have sent and gone through the FOIA process, the Freedom of Information process. I've gone through that at the town, the state, and the federal level. I've gotten many documents that probably would have been buried forever. In some ways, I guess that's kind of a form of citizen whistleblower. It's amazing that the only whistleblowing that I've heard of in the last bunch of years would be Snowden and this guy Assange locked up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And these two guys have been pillared and just tarred and feathered for literally years and years and years, whereas Snowden hiding out in Russia, I believe, still. Why in the world, with all of these so-called public servants, government workers, that clearly see documents and they see insights that I think if the average person saw, they would go, wow, that is truly amazing that this is going on. And it's up and down from the local to the state to the federal level. The level of odd stuff going on and bad behavior exists up and down the system, the food chain. Why do we have no whistleblowers? Why does no one come clean, seemingly ever?
They don't want to end up in jail. There's an executive order issued in 2009 by the Obama administration about secrecy and classification that says, reasonably enough, that criminality or fraud or waste cannot be a rationale for classifying something. Nevertheless, what we've seen under the Insider Threat Program is more employees prosecuted or attempted to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917 than all previous administrations combined, which gives you a clue as to the cluelessness of people who said, well, why didn't Snowden just bring this to the, up the chain of command rather than steal it? Because he didn't want to be charged under the Espionage Act and put away potentially for 30 years in prison. The NSA, I know 2 or 3 people personally who were involved, who saw a sort of homebrewed house system that worked very well in surveillancing potential terrorists, but would protect the rights of American citizens. And that was thrown overboard for this vastly more expensive system developed by SAIC, an outside contractor that didn't protect your privacy and was less effective. But that was the corporate decision at NSA. And when these people objected, they were charged with the Espionage Act. In the case of Thomas Drake, the presiding judge was scathing about the thing when the NSA, the Justice Department prosecutors, were going to charge him with espionage. And then once the trial came up, they had such a flimsy case that they reduced it to a misdemeanor of storing classified information on a private computer. And it was retroactively classified, I might add. So the judge said, this is ridiculous. But the problem was the damage was done. He'd lost his job. He was destitute because of legal fees. And he was made an object lesson for any other employee of the NSA.
If you take the money to be an employee of the government, the pressures, and there's a lot of different types of pressures, but the pressures to do the right thing don't exist.
In theory, they do, but in practice, they don't. It's get with the program.
We've kind of touched on it a little bit. I want to dive back into it. You know, look, this is the first, I think it's probably the first time in the history of America, basically got an entire generation of people, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, folks over 100 years of age, they were told, if you save your money, you're going to have a certain amount of interest income. Now we're looking at, clearly all the way back to the dot-com bubble, but especially the last 8 years, there's been no interest income. We're about to go to negative interest income. Mike, if I look at the last 15 years of deep state activities, if I look at the way the interest rate curve has been manipulated, and if I look at a situation that every time we have extremely low rates and a very high stock market, usually something bad happens.
Right, because there's no stable way to get a little bit of interest income. It forces money into things like equities and real estate and creates bubbles in those. Just as it created from Alan Greenspan, artificially lowering the interest rate after 9/11 was one of the factors, not the only one, but one of the factors leading to the housing bubble. So yeah, there's something wrong with it. In a sense, it becomes a tremendous economic distortion that's almost the mirror image of the stagflation of the 1970s, where you had persistent high interest rates that were also harming the economy and distorting it.
Mike, I want to go into the Middle East a little bit. I know we're jumping subjects, but look, the way that your work is outlined and laid out, all of these things tie together. I mean, this apparatus, this deep state apparatus is involved in so many things. But let's go into the Middle East a little bit, and let's talk about the military industrial complex, especially the notion of I must have a war on. If there's not a conflict, create a conflict. But if you can also dovetail that in and connect it with some of the current headlines that I'm seeing right now, and you talk about this some in your work, Saudi Arabia, this missing 28 pages. Why don't you give the audience some perspective about this need to create war and perhaps shine a little light from your perspective on what you might know about 9/11? Because it seems like we're about to learn things that we really did not want to learn, and perhaps soon.
Well, the connection between the Saudi royal family and the oligarchy here is very deep. It goes back, in fact, to 1945, the meeting between the Saudi king and President Roosevelt on the cruiser Augusta in the Red Sea, we're not quite sure what was exactly in that agreement, but we can infer that it was kind of a carte blanche grant of protection to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia if they would keep pumping oil. Now, this deepened in the 1970s after Nixon cut the link between the dollar and gold. The dollar was plummeting, and there was perhaps thought in sight that the dollar could cease being the world reserve currency. But we roped in the Saudis as a way of maintaining the dollar as the world reserve currency by an agreement that they would sort of faithfully recycle the petrodollars that they got from oil back into the New York money markets and occasionally make, multi-billion-dollar purchases of arms. And this has become kind of a self-licking ice cream cone, a perpetual motion machine that keeps the dollar the world reserve currency, even though we're running persistent trade and current account deficits, and it allows us to keep interest rates low so that we can finance that debt. So there's a lot of reasons beyond just their having the oil that they're kind of a prop to the deep state. The notion that elements in Saudi Arabia might have been cognizant, might have been complicit in 9/11 is definitely something the Bush family or the Cheney with their oil connections wouldn't want to see come out. The interesting thing is that we're now in the 8th year of Barack Obama's presidency, and only now are they talking about declassifying that 28 pages. I don't think we'll be really that surprised that there's collusion or at least private connections to rich people or rich elements in Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda, because they've been financing jihadist movements since the 1970s, some of it at our behest.
Let me dig into Obama a little bit. We've talked about Bush. We've talked about Obama a little bit. I remember back to that campaign season when he won his first election to be president against McCain. He had these great rallies. There was this fantastic energy. So many young people were going out, and there was a real spin in the kind of hope and change stuff. And it obviously fell short. And now you start to wonder, has that same audience, that's why they're so recalcitrant and so diehard on Sanders. And you hear those Sanders supporters say, if Hillary gets it, we're not going for her. It's almost like they see we were burned by Obama. It didn't work out. And now we're going to ride Sanders. And if he doesn't work out, we're gone. I want to bring Obama up because, he seems like, I probably have different politics than he does. But, he's a U.S. Senator from Illinois. He got elected to be president. He had this platform of hope and change. And as you've mentioned also in this conversation, literally nothing has changed, and things you could only argue have gotten worse on just about every front. What happened? Did he get inside? Did he know the system was there before he got there? Or did he get inside and realize that he literally was just going to be another piece of the deep state and really had no control? Or did he just not care?
I can't do mind reading, but I can infer from what I saw. I'm not particularly, disillusioned or disappointed because I saw what happened before he even became president. In early 2008, he not only said he would oppose any legislation to retroactively indemnify the telecommunications companies from colluding in illegal surveillance of American citizens. He would filibuster such legislation. Yet, in mid-2008, just before he was, shall we say, coronated at the convention in Denver, he voted for the FISA Amendments Act, which did precisely that, which indemnified the contractors. And I figured the fix is in. So I'm not going to assume any sort of sea change in policy. Now, it was only later that I learned that a certain John Brennan, CIA official under Bush, had late in the Bush administration left the CIA and had become an advisor, a foreign policy advisor, to Senator and presidential candidate Barack Obama. Brennan said later in an interview that he had, quote unquote, schooled Obama in foreign policy. Aside from that tone of headmasterly condescension, it kind of makes you wonder, is the tail wagging the dog? Who's running the show here?
You know, I want to bring up another example of a pretty famous individual where I think you could also wonder what happened. And that would be Colin Powell. And you look back to the Iraq War, it was his stature, his gravitas was used to sell that war. Pretty much after it was sold, it almost seems like he knows he was sold. He's kind of disappeared with his reputation in tatters. I wonder when I look at that situation, because this was a guy that was really held out highly, and you wonder, well, did he know what was going down, or was he fell on his sword for the deep state?
I'm not really surprised. Colin Powell has always sort of, during his career, maintained this sort of noblest Roman of them all persona, that he was above politics, simply a public servant. But I think what he did there at the UN was so egregious, and he knew the stuff was false, that he had to fall on his sword. But if you look back in his career during Iran-Contra, he was the principal military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, Cap Weinberger. So he knew what was going on in Iran-Contra, knew about the arms diversions and all the skullduggery. And if you dial even further back, when he was a mid-level officer in Vietnam, he was in the chain of command when a few whistleblowers reported the My Lai massacre. But you don't see him as the hero of the piece. You don't see or read about him at all. This is only known, from subsequent research. So he's been involved in a lot of activities that were, say, not noble necessarily, and he somehow managed to keep his skirts clean. My own private theory, I can't prove it, is he was a very useful source for Bob Woodward. I noticed every time Powell had military duty where he was stationed in Washington, D.C., Bob Woodward wrote a book. And in the book, there's either anonymous sources dishing dirt, or if Colin Powell is mentioned, it's always in a very favorable context.
Two things left I'd like to dive in with you, Mike. Number one, as we're talking personalities, I'd like to go back to 1992, the election of Bill Clinton. And I want to bring that up to perhaps what you seem to be outlining, which will be the deep state's choice for this year, his wife as the next president. But let's go back in time a little bit on Clinton, because it's a really interesting situation. A guy coming from a small, I think many people might say backwater state. I mean, kind of a state with definitely not a powerful state, but it was a state, and he used it as a platform. He got elected. And once he got in there, I mean, look, a lot of things happened. You had the dot-com bubble. He had his intern dalliances. But the most interesting thing, perhaps, to me was the so-called liberal coming in. People called him the first black president. But that guy sure surrounded himself with Goldman Sachs about as fast as he possibly could. I mean, where was the Democratic Party? Where was those voters on the left? I mean, he did not exactly operate like a standard issue kind of bleeding heart liberal, did he? I mean, he seemed like he was fully engaged with Goldman Sachs.
Oh, he definitely was. Now, again, bringing up Bob Woodward, he wrote a book in the mid-'90s about Clinton's first couple of years in office. He recounts some scene early in his first term where all these people are standing around. I think one of them's James Carville, and his economic advisors are telling him his infrastructure program to invest in America and all that sort of stuff is not going to work because it will send the wrong signal to the bond markets, which will raise interest rates, which will choke off any stimulus that the infrastructure program would have provided. So he looks at the group and says, "You mean my economic program is hostage to a bunch of effing bond traders?" And they said, "Yep, Mr. President, that's about the case." Very soon, he replaced Lloyd Benson as his Treasury Secretary with Robert Rubin from Goldman Sachs. He had other people in there like Larry Summers. I think during his term, he reappointed Alan Greenspan. And that troika pretty much ran the show for the benefit of Wall Street, lobbied for the repeal of Glass-Steagall, pretty much squashed Brooksley Born, who was head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, I think it was, when she wanted to regulate derivatives, because she foresaw what exactly happened with things like these synthetic CDOs. They blew up the economy.
What I think is really interesting, too, about the Clinton case, that'd be Bill and Hillary, is that once he steps aside, in the 15, 16 years, once he stepped aside, the two of them, and I don't know for the life of me why Bernie Sanders keeps talking about a couple $100,000, because it's been fully reported that the two of them combined have made $153 million in speaking fees in the last 15 years. That is a phenomenal number for two people that were just a part of Arkansas, and then literally in short order are well on the way to a family having $1 billion net worth in the decades to come. And that's it's a sad tale for how things unfold, because once you get in there, and I think the Clintons have really led the way. They have shown, doesn't make a difference what party you're a part of, if you're willing to play ball and help the deep state go. They didn't get that $153 million just for excuse my French, for shits and giggles. They got that $153 million because the deep state wanted something.
Sure, it was retroactive payment for services rendered. Perhaps Sanders uses it because big numbers sort of bounce off the consciousness of the American public, like pebbles off an Abrams tank. As I recall earlier in my career in the 80s, it was a big scandal when Boeing charged the Pentagon $600 for a hammer. People understand that because they know you can buy a hammer for $20 down at Home Depot. But when the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad under Paul Bremer lost track of $12 billion, they don't know whether it's 12 million, 12 billion. They don't understand the order of magnitude. It's just so big that it has no meaning to their daily lives.
Mike, why do you think, let's look at the Democratic Party right now. Why do you think the Democratic Party is so split? I can look at the Sanders side of the equation. I see this on Facebook. I see really strong arguments. I see a very engaged electorate. They are going to rallies. They have a very strong message. They want to break up these banks on Wall Street. Some of that message, I think when Bernie Sanders talks about what happened on Wall Street, I don't care what partisan stripe or no partisan stripe you are, what Sanders talks about Wall Street is spot on. But I'm curious, when I look at the Clinton audience, how does this spell get cast over so many voters, to just believe that this woman who stands there, and I saw she was introduced the other day by some congressman playing this Donna Summer song, "She Works Hard for the Money," not even realizing how insane that was as a lead-up song. She works hard for the money. Not really. So I'm looking at this, but what I don't understand is, how did we get a situation where there's this actively engaged Sanders audience and then this Clinton audience, and it looks like she's probably going to win, and these people just trust her? What do they trust? It's like they've got a spell cast on them.
Why do working class people think Trump, the guy who set up Trump University, and the main economic lesson it imparted was don't fall for a scam like Trump University? He's viciously fought unionization in his hotel on the Strip. The other hotels are actually unionized, and his workers get $3 an hour average less. He's run all kinds of stuff like that. He's run pyramid schemes. Sorry, I think that the politically correct term is multi-level marketing. Pyramid schemes to sell dietary supplements, and that went bust. So why do they think that this billionaire is going to solve their problems when he's had, 4 corporate bankruptcies and a lot of shady deals? It's precisely for the same reason that women think Hillary Clinton is the cat's meow, that any criticism of her is Clinton derangement syndrome, and they just simply won't take cognizance of the fact that she had extremely poor judgment as Secretary of State with respect to Libya. She let herself get talked into that by Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, who was looking for oil concessions for his national oil companies. I think in both cases it comes down to people being blinded by ideological labels and the fact that they're Democrats or Republicans first. I view myself as an American citizen first, but before even that, I view myself as a conscious, sentient being who owes an obligation to himself to learn what the facts are and follow the facts, not an ideology.
You just very astutely laid out the points that I think any of the never Trump hashtags would say. You laid them all out. But what I'm curious about, though, too, is that, and I might be included in this group, I'm kind of excited, though, when I watch so many Republicans literally having breakdowns over the rise of Trump. So many Republican leaders. There's a part of me that excites. It's not because I think Trump is a perfect candidate, but there is a side of me that's very excited that I can watch all of these people that have been telling me these things they're going to do that they never do, or why we need these wars and we really don't. There's a side of me that, and I think a lot of the people that are voting for Trump feel the same way. Like, it's almost like we don't really even care what his issues are. I'm not saying that's not saying my position, but it seems like a lot of people don't even care about his issues, really. It's more like, okay, we're kind of with him on this trade thing. We want America to be great, and everyone hates him on the Republican side, so let's vote for him.
Well, there's that. An acquaintance of mine, Bruce Bartlett, who was also a Republican operative who left the party, and I don't know whether he's an independent or still labels himself a Republican. He explained that he's voting for Trump precisely to destroy the Republican Party structure, the oligarchy that runs it, because it's so bad. He doesn't have any realistic expectation that he would be elected, but that he would destroy the party. Now, I think that's a nice theory. It's kind of like cheering on Adolf Hitler invading the Soviet Union. They're both really bad, but, the theory might be you want them to take out this other totalitarian power. But what happens if he succeeds?
That leads me to my last question. It seems like the deep state is so entrenched it's really hard to imagine any big change, which again, I think gets back to the Trump and Sanders thing, why there's excitement there and why there's traction, because people view them as big change. But I think if we were to sit down over a beer, I think you would basically say, Michael, the next president will be Hillary Clinton. So what's the end game for America? What, how does the deep, you've got some great points that you make in your book, some solutions, and I know they're hopeful. But if we really have to look at, let's say, the next 5 years, next 10 years, next 15 years, next 20 years, is there really anything on the horizon, Mike, where this deep state entrenchment goes away? Do they really lose their grip? I don't see how they lose their grip.
Yeah, I wouldn't have foreseen Trump and Sanders a year ago. Now, Hillary will probably get reelected and try to extend the status quo.
I like how you say that, reelected.
Sorry, that's a Freudian slip. I guess it's the same old, group of people. If she's elected, she will attempt to extend the status quo. But I don't think you can get the forces, back in the box that were let out during this campaign. And I think time is going to be on the side of millennials who basically were screwed by the 2008 financial meltdown. They've grown up without all this cultural baggage of the culture wars from the 60s. The early baby boomers, of which I'm kind of a mid-boomer, the trailing edge of the silent generation, all that group that is now in their mid-60s to mid-70s, they've been saturated with this culture wars stuff for the last 50 years, and it's tiresome. And, I, for one, the millennials get a lot of criticism as being slackers or whatever. They can't be any worse than baby boomers like Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, both very self-indulgent, self-centered individuals that just happen to be in different parties.
I think you make a great point about Sanders and Trump, and what they've really opened up is a window for all of us to see electorates, and maybe it's really just the same group, just frankly chasing two different people right now, Trump and Sanders. But you're right. I think other enterprising politicians in the future, as long as they, have some sense of realism to them, I think other people are going to look at that audience, and I start to wonder: are we truly at the point? I thought we might have been there back in the Perot days, but are we truly at the point where there really is a legitimate opportunity for a third party?
Yeah, third parties do not generally fare well in our system. More likely, the whole landscape is rigged against them. However, I think the better chance remains that improvements come through a takeover of one or both of the parties.
But the deep state's still going to own everything. When's that? That doesn't change anytime soon, does it?
If we were ever able to get the money out of politics, that would be the precursor. That's the precondition for any other reform.
Mike, it's really fascinating stuff. I appreciate you taking some time today. Is there anything from your perspective that you want to add? We've covered a lot of territory. I don't know if there's anything that you've been thinking about or writing about in the last few weeks or months that's really at the top of your mind right now.
Well, I think we pretty much covered the waterfront. All I could do is, suggest to your listeners, pick up a copy of The Deep State, preferentially at your independent bookseller or Amazon or Barnes & Noble if you must.
Yes, and just to repeat that for everybody, The Deep State, the fall of the Constitution and the rise of a shadow government. And that's an interesting title, and it's provocative. But I think, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is just going down the rabbit hole and making observations about where we are today.
Absolutely.
Mike, is there a website or anything, or just best to send everybody to the book?
There's the book, and I have my own website, www.mikelofgren.net.
Mike, thank you for the time today. Hopefully we can catch up on the backside of perhaps
when the next crisis happens, and we can circle back and compare notes.
Well, I cringe at the next crisis, but I look forward in that event to talking with you.
You're not familiar with flow? Today you will learn more. Today you will walk away with a good understanding of the flow state and why, no matter what, the money, the success, the power, flow is what we're all after. And you can't buy it with money. No way, no how. You have to get to the flow state. Stephen Kotler has done some great work, but even he would say there is one man, the leading authority on the flow state. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Check out his TED videos. Check out anything you can find about him. I've tried like crazy to get him on the podcast. Maybe I will get him. But I've been a patient man for a couple years. So far, no luck. He does not give many presentations. I have found very few. But his early work in the flow state is mission critical. I would like to play an excerpt today from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I hope you enjoy.
What kind of occurred to me when I read the title of this conference here, Happiness and its Causes, I suppose what we are doing here in trying to interpret what the causes of happiness are, it seemed to me that there is a very short answer to what the cause of happiness is. And the answer is that the causes of happiness are sitting here. Each one of you is sitting in a chair where the cause of your happiness is sitting before you. In other words, we can't really tell you, nobody can tell you how to reach happiness except yourself. Happiness doesn't exist as an entity that somehow we are chasing and trying to reach, because there is no happiness except for what's inside of yourself. And nobody can really make you happy, just as in many ways nobody can make you unhappy either. But then the question, of course, becomes, okay, if each one of us is responsible and in control of their happiness, how do you get it? Because unfortunately, not everybody is happy. In fact, even though all the surveys show that most people are above a kind of middling level of happiness and very few people are completely unhappy, the fact is that very few people also are really as happy as they expected to be or could be. So the question is about the causes of happiness is really, how do we make it possible for ourselves to feel this level of fully living that has been called happiness. From time immemorial, people distinguished between being fully alive and feeling depressed, feeling anxious. And there is a level of experience that we all recognize as being, okay, this seems to be happy. And it's represented in many forms. The dance and songs that preceded this more boring lecture is an expression of happiness, trying to express something that we all recognize and we all would like occasionally to experience. There was a poet you all heard about, Dante Alighieri, who in Italy wrote one of the most famous epic poems called the Divine Comedy. And he wrote once, this is 700 years ago, so a long time ago, he wrote that people really feel that any living thing feels most fully alive and enjoyed living when he or she is able to express who they are. They can express what they feel, what they would like to feel, and they act that out. And the expression of life, in a sense, is what we would call happiness. It's what we are, when we are fully expressing our strengths, whether the strength is a strength of creating beauty or a moral strength or a physical strength, somehow we are able to say, yes, this is who we are, this is what I am, and this is what I can do. And when you are able to do that, you experience something that makes life suddenly matter, that you feel that, yes, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is who I am. Now, that realization is one that came to me partly from my own experience of World War II, which I spent in Europe, which made me aware that some people, even under the worst circumstances, seem to maintain their integrity, their purpose, their joy, whereas others, once they lose their supports of financial well-being or status, or their property is lost, they kind of crumble and they become empty shells in many ways. They become bitter and unable to function. So I became, as a child, already interested in trying to figure out what makes the difference between people who have an inner strength or habits that they have cultivated in their lives that make them able to enjoy life regardless of the external circumstances, and those who survive essentially by leaning on the supports that their society provides them, and once those supports disappear, they themselves are helpless. When I started psychology, I became interested in answering those questions, and what the kind of result was what I tried to present in 18 minutes from now, although it took me about 40 years to get here, but anyway. Flow this is a kind of a summary of what I tried to say in the past few minutes, that you can live either as a pawn of external forces, or you can live, you can master your own destiny to a certain extent. And this act of living under your own control rather than being pulled by the strings of fortune and fate, that's what I call flow. And this is something I simply learned by talking to people who seem to have some passion about life that differentiated them from everyday people. And I call this flow because the people themselves started talking, when they described how it felt to be truly alive, to be completely functioning, they use the metaphor of being like carried by a river, carried by a current, and feeling that there is no necessity to worry or make choices because you are carried on by a force, almost internal force that works outside. And as I say, this happens in when we sing, we dance, as happened just a few minutes ago here, when we do sports. But then very quickly I realized that the interesting part is not about flow. It's not that you can do it when you separate yourself from everyday life and you do something artistic or athletic, but you can do flow when you're studying, when you're working, when you're at home and with the family. And that's really the best application of flow, is how you can use it in everyday life. Now, but today I will talk about our work with athletes and artists because that's where it's easier to see what flow is about. So the first, let's see. The first condition of flow is that you are focusing your attention on a very restricted field of stimuli until you get fully concentrated and completely involved. Now, that is in contrast to what happens to us in everyday life, where there are distractions constantly pulling and pushing on our attention, with the fact that to the extent that we lose control over our attention because we have to move it, we're pulled by outside forces or stimuli. I mean, just the cell phone or the traffic on the road or whatever, or the telephone or the people who stop us at work. And all of that results in our diffusing attention, but more importantly, of feeling that the control over our life is being taken over. And now this, so in games or sports, you get to the point where you can really focus for hours, sometimes like in chess, for instance, where you can spend half a day without having to change your focus. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in your head when you're playing in a tournament. You are anticipating hundreds of possible moves and the consequences over time of those moves and how. So you are very active mentally, but you are concentrated. And as it says, you could, in fact, we had people for whom the ceiling fell off and they didn't notice until afterwards, and the people were cleaning their jacket from the plaster that fell down. But so it's not an exaggeration that you can achieve that concentration in any game form or any aesthetic, artistic form. You get there. In everyday life, we would like to have this too, occasionally at least, but it is much harder. And the question is how to organize life so that you can have that concentration in every day. There comes a point when you are no longer focusing attention consciously. You are simply, the attention gets so involved in the activity that it moves by itself without conscious control over it. That's, for instance, this rock climber who's up in Yosemite in California. He's saying that, you get to the point when you forget that you are climbing. You feel that you're part of the rock, you're part of the winds that are blowing and the sunshine, and all of this is, you have a role of trying to move up, but you are you're doing that because this is what you have to do if you want to experience this feeling. And you are in harmony with what you're doing. You're not under obligation. It's an inner feeling of being part of this activity. The other thing is that people say that you have, when you are so involved in these activities, you are not worried anymore about things that could go wrong, because, as we'll see later, you are prepared for it. This kind, the flow experience rarely happens by itself. It's the culmination of having prepared yourself in some way or the other, either by learning music or by climbing or by, in this case, for instance, this is a former student of mine, Susan Jackson, who teaches here in Australia, and she has interviewed many Olympic athletes. Cyclists are her favorite. And here is this peloton moving together and being able, the chances of falling or interfering with each other are there, but you don't feel them because you said, okay, I learned how to do this, I'm good at it, and now it's going by itself. And people say I'm climbing a rock like the ones before we saw, I feel safer there than trying to cross an intersection in a big city where I don't know, a taxi driver may run into me or whatever. Here I'm in control. I have my life in my hands, so to speak. Then you get to the point where your attention is so taken by what you're doing that you really start forgetting yourself as a separate person. For instance, one of the first professions we studied where flow seems to be very widespread is surgery. Surgeons usually, if you ask them how does it feel to do surgery, they will use, they find analogies from sport. They say, oh, it's like skiing a lot, or it's like sailing, or it's like whatever sport they know about, they use that analogy to describe surgery because it requires this great concentration and very, very fine muscle coordination and holding the scalpel and so forth. But you're not aware of anything else. You are not aware of the problems you have as a citizen, as a father, as a mother, as a whatever you are in other roles in life. Now you are simply there purely as a surgeon who has a difficult task to accomplish. The other thing is that you forget time. Here is a disco dancer describing how it is to, and this description is very common actually, that in retrospect, when you look back on what happened, it seems like just a few minutes. What you did lasted a few minutes only. But while you're doing it, you are not even aware of time at all. It's not an issue. You're just moving along with what's happening. That's partly why we call this the flow experience. And when all of these conditions are present, the activity becomes autotelic. And autotelic means that the Greek word, two words, auto means self, and telos is goal. Autotelic, the goal is just to do the activity. You're not concerned about even succeeding or getting paid or any of those things. Even the surgeon gets paid a lot of money, of course, and has a high status. But the fact is that unless the surgeon experiences flow, he will soon become sloppy and uninterested in doing the best of what he's doing if he's in it only for the money. But usually surgeons begin to find in precision, excellence of performance, the goal, not in what happens after and however much money they may make as a result of it. Here is, for instance, a quite well-known American composer who also trains young people to play in orchestra. And this is what he says when I asked him, what do you tell young people about what they can expect in the future as musicians? And this is what he says: don't expect a damn thing, do it because you love it. And that is a definition of being autotelic. And the goal is to just do it because you love it, and then hope that you can make some money out of it if that's how you want to make a living. These are the conditions of flow. Now the question is, how does flow happen? Okay, one thing is that flow occurs not when you have a long-term goal. The long-term goal is necessary often, but that's not where flow comes from. Flow comes from being able to do right the next thing. If you are playing a musical instrument, you don't play it in order to get to the end. You play it for the next note, the next chord. And then when it's over, when you finish, you say, gee, I wish it would continue, but the song ends, but you don't play it to end. And the rock climber here again says that climbing is, you have to decide every move what the next move is, and that process of deciding, do I put my fingers up here or down here? It makes a big difference. Here you have to pull yourself up and spend energy. Here you don't go as far up, and so you have to decide which is the best way to do the next move, and that is very important. Then after the goals is you get feedback to what you're doing, you hear the music you're playing, or you notice that you're still on the wall instead of falling down the rock. You're still there, so that's good feedback. And then the final condition, which is very important, is the balance between what can be done and what you can do. That is what the challenge of the situation and your ability to meet up with it. And this was the original way I tried to describe that. You have skills going this horizontally and challenges vertically. The flow occurs in that diagonal when the two are in balance. Since then, anxiety is high challenge, low skill. Boredom is high skill, low challenge. A person starts at A, playing something very simple, but after a while you get bored playing that, and then if you want to continue, enjoy playing, you have to up the challenge, play something more difficult. And then you're back in flow. And you can stay there for a while unless your parents tell you to play Chopin when you just started, and then you're up in anxiety, and at that point you can quit because it's too difficult. Or you can say, well, if I develop my skills, I can go back into flow. This is the progression of flow over time, and I can tell you that this is how we live our life. Between these different aspects of how much skill and challenge relate to each other. And arousal, flow, and control are all very positive in a sense. And then it gets worse as we go. Apathy is worse for some people, and anxiety for others, but it's because that's when you can't really express who you are. In apathy, you have nothing to do and you have no skills. You feel you are just a lump on with nothing to do, you're out of life. And anxiety, you feel overwhelmed.
I want to play one more excerpt from Mihai about flow, creativity, and the evolving self.
When we think of people who are highly creative, one of the major, I think, cultural images, stereotypes, or perhaps archetypes, is the one of the struggling artist, the person who suffers, whose life is miserable, who sacrifices their happiness for the sake of their creative output. Your research seemed to indicate that this is not exactly normal for creative people.
A lot of this myth comes from fairly recent developments in our culture. Before the Renaissance, the artists were very upstanding, normal parts of their culture, and now it's almost expected that you should be struggling and suffering, but it's not certainly part of what it takes to be creative. It may be a byproduct of creativity when the culture ignores the artist, when the culture puts too many obstacles in the way of a person who wants to express herself or himself in poetry or art or music. And as a result of the being ignored and opposed, many of them end up breaking down in various ways. But it's not the part that makes them creative. Creativity can coexist with a very happy and full life.
And your work seems to suggest that people who are creative are also very productive and healthy in their approach to life.
Yeah. I studied creativity in a variety of fields, including the traditional fields of the arts and music and literature, but also I was interested in creativity in science. And so many of the people I interviewed were physicists, chemists, biologists, like Jonas Salk, who discovered the polio vaccine, and individuals, 15 Nobel Prize winners in the group. And also businessmen and statesmen who contributed to the culture and changed the way we live, changed the way we think. Certainly, these people, on the whole, led fairly normal, happy, contented lives. Creativity seems to involve mental problems more in some of the arts, like playwrights, poets often have problems, but I think that is partly because of the way in which the culture responds to their work. But certainly scientists and people who contribute to the culture outside of the arts are rarely prey to this kind of disturbance that since Romanticism we attribute to creativity.
Well, one of the characteristics that I seem to see a thread running through the 90 or so people that you studied in depth who were highly creative is that while I don't think that they needed to unnecessarily challenge themselves, they often overcame unusual challenges that confronted them.
Yeah. That was one of the interesting things, is that if you look at the background of the people I interviewed, they seem to come from two very different family types and backgrounds. They either come from fairly disturbed families. By disturbed, I mean that the father probably died before you were 10 years old, which happened to a lot of these people.
In fact, you even quote Sartre at one point saying that the best gift the father can give his son is to die early.
That's right. That was told by some of the people I interviewed. They referred back to Le Mot by Sartre. And so that is characteristic of almost half of the sample, that they overcame a very difficult childhood. But the interesting thing is then there's an equal number of children whose parents were intellectuals, artists, professionals who were opened up a lot of possibilities to them in childhood, who exposed them to a lot of new ideas and who supported them in various ways. So it's not that creativity is determined by one or the other of this childhood
environments, it shows that that it's possible to overcome or to use the supports that you have. But what's missing is the great middle ground. Normal families are not represented very well among our creatives.
Isn't that interesting? How do you account for that?
Well, I think if you have a fairly comfortable childhood, but without too much support and too much challenge, but comfortable, you don't see the necessity to stretch yourself, to get into new situations, to explore, to break through boundaries. You just are comfortable, and you go ahead with living that way.
It sounds as if what you're saying is that amongst Western, let's say, middle-class families, there is a kind of numbing influence where the lower classes and perhaps the upper classes break through that somehow.
Yeah, that's how it looks, actually. And even in terms of economic background, they come from poor families or fairly well off, but not the middle. That makes, in a sense, you can... after the fact, it's easy to see why that should be like that. I think it also tells you that if you want your child to benefit the most from the opportunities that are potentially there in life, you should stretch yourself a little bit as a parent.
I think sometimes we take it for granted that we have such brilliant minds that we can all access so easily at a fingertip. And even then, we're lazy. We don't go find those excerpts. We don't go find that information. We don't go find that analysis. We don't go find that wisdom. I love finding it. And if there was ever one man that I would have loved to have learned from, Mihai would be great, for sure, no doubt. But probably at the top of my list would be Alan Watts. Read everything you can by Watts. Listen to Watts. Oh, you only come to the Mike Covel podcast because you want to know about making money? You want to know about trading? Let me ask you a question. Have you noticed that trading psychology, the emotional state, Daniel Kahneman and his Nobel Prize, have you happened to notice how important this is to making money? You can have all the rules, but if you don't know about the flow and you don't know about the moment of right now, you're going to go in circles and you're never going to get to that reward you're chasing. And if you worry, that's the worst. Stop worrying.
Douglas Emlen is an evolutionary biologist and professor of biology at the University of Montana. His research, among many research topics, but his core research provides insights into the development and evolution of exaggerated male weaponry, such as the horns found in scarab beetles. Think saber-toothed cats. Think the massive antlers on elk. I don't even recall exactly how I found out about Doug, but I saw this excerpt. I followed the trail, as I've done on so many of my podcasts. I went to his website. I saw this book he has called Animal Weapons. I read it, and I said, wow, this has got to be an interesting conversation. This man has gone down a very original path in his life, and not expecting to find what he found on his journey is extremely insightful for all of us. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Douglas Emlen.
Hello, are you there?
Hey, Doug, how are you?
I am well. I just saw your message about 10 minutes ago. I'm sorry.
No. I didn't know when you were on, so sometimes people like to start earlier. I'm easygoing about it.
So it's late at night your time, huh? Or 13 hours later, anyway.
Yeah, it's 9:15 here. 9:15.
Wow.
But I've gotten used to it, because I've been doing the podcast from first year from the States, San Diego, and then the last 2 years in Asia. So I've got to actually kind of like doing the the nighttime podcast because like having a conversation with someone, you just call someone up and chit chat. And
so what moved you to Asia? I mean, I read up a little bit on you just a couple minutes ago. It sounds like you've only been over there a couple of years. Is it because of investments in marketing stuff?
I was doing a speaking tour in 2013 and it was supposed to be extended like 4 months. And when it was over, I was supposed to go back to San Diego and I was like, I really don't feel like leaving.
Wow, cool.
So that's
I'm just
simple.
curious because most of my research is on rhinoceros beetles these days, genetics and genomics of weapons and looking at rhino beetles. And a lot of the rhino beetle diversity is right over where you are. So we do field work in Japan. We have a lot of colleagues in Japan. We're talking about sampling populations across Asia. It's a part of the world I haven't been to. I mean, I've been to Japan for 2 days. That's it. All my other stuff is Africa, Central South America. So I'm really curious to see it.
I tell you what, in terms of Vietnam, I do know there's some biodiversity in areas of Vietnam that have basically been untouched. Even with all the conflict, believe it or not, there's just, mature, deep jungles that are just, land of the lost kind of place,
Yeah, I like those kinds of places.
I imagine you do.
Those are the places they seek out. So,
well, have you heard about the cave in Vietnam?
I have not.
They've just found the largest cave in the world. There's actually a jungle growing inside the cave, or part of it collapsed. You should just Google largest cave in the world in Vietnam. It'll come up. It's insane. I mean, wow. For a guy like you, it's probably like a field day of things that no one's ever seen.
Exactly. When you get things that are isolated like that, you can get all kinds of diversity that's sort of unmatched anywhere else in the world. Neat. No, I'd never heard of it.
Yeah. So. And what's funny too is you talk about the diversity, and we move into this subject we're going to talk about today. And I was thinking to myself, and I didn't even know where to start. I've literally got like 7 pages of notes in front of me because you kind of are going wide and deep in a lot of different areas in animal weapons. But I thought for me, I was just thinking about the subject and where you ultimately start to draw parallels. And we're going to work our way back to the dung beetles to the beginning. But I was thinking, wow, America saw what happens during, for example, Pearl Harbor with the Japanese, kind of this, all the biggest ships in the world sitting targets. And then you saw what happened in terms of fighting in Vietnam, where you show up with all the traditional troops and traditional types of fighting a war. And then all of a sudden, the people they're fighting say, oh, we don't want to fight like that. We're going to cause you problems with a different style of fighting. And so I couldn't help but think, as I'm going through your book on animal weapons,
sure,
the parallels are just right there staring at me in the face.
I think the parallels are everywhere. And these are the sneak tactics, right?
Right.
These are the, if you can't play by the rules, break the rules. And asymmetric warfare like that, we were the asymmetric, or the guerrillas during the Revolutionary War.
Right, exactly.
I mean, we refused to face the Brits on an open field of battle under conventional rules, and I think that this is the problem we face today as a military, pretty much wherever we go. I mean, we're dealing with pipe bombs and IEDs and suicide bombers and non-conventional warfare because nobody else has the infrastructure or the costly weapons to sort of match us toe to toe. And, if you want to talk sneaking, the problem, I'm happy to go off in any direction. And, the worst I'm going to do is piss people off with some of these ideas. But the things that scare me the most, and I don't know if I dare go there. Are you recording right now?
Sure.
Okay. Maybe I'll shut up before I go.
No. Seriously, go where you were to go. If you say something bad and we don't like it afterwards, we'll snip it and tell the audience that you said something too controversial.
Yeah, well, we can come back to the dung beetles and start with the biology and build up from first principles. It's just that once you start making these parallels, it's hard to stop. And so a couple of the scary things that emerged from this work for me, one of them was realizing that the political confrontations on the world landscape, if you will, that based on animals, we would predict would be the most dangerous, the ones that are the most likely to escalate, are matched rivalries between opponents that are sort of toe-to-toe, face-to-face, and relatively evenly armed and relatively sort of even in terms of economies and the amount that they can afford to invest into militaries. And so it makes some very quick predictions about hot spots on the globe where you've got rivals potentially with weapons of mass destruction at their disposal that are sort of going face to face. And it also makes predictions about the United States and who the most likely next big rival would be. And it's a country that I would personally prefer that we not enter into an arms race with. But all arrows point to China as the only other place out there that has the potential within the near future to match us toe to toe in this kind of a one-on-one face-off, this type of a duel. That, again, if we're going to take our lessons from animals, the lesson we learn is that's exactly the kind of confrontation that has the greatest potential to spiral out of control. So as a this isn't my realm, but it scares me when I look at the political stage and I sort of figure out what the chess pieces are likely to be. And the other thing I have to point out, you're talking about sneaky strategies, the sort of asymmetric things that we faced, the United States troops faced in Vietnam, and that the Soviets faced in Afghanistan, and that we face now in parts of the Middle East. The other sneaky strategy that nobody's talking about, or at least they're not talking about in this context, the one that really makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, is cyber hacking. That is like the ultimate insidious sneak. And there's evidence now that again, it comes to all arrows point to China, but that there are hackers that are infiltrating our military infrastructure and our software systems that we need to fly our fighter planes or to navigate our aircraft carriers or to guide our missiles. And that's interesting because you can have these incredibly sophisticated, expensive weapons that are amazing in what they're capable of. And then you can have essentially a shoestring budget style sneak strategy that worms its way in there and completely undermines the effectiveness of these most state-of-the-art weapons. And there's all kinds of little hints that this is happening, but I don't think people are sort of connecting the dots that way, and it scares the daylights out of me.
In defense of China, to play devil's advocate, I would hazard a guess that they are not the only ones involved in cyber espionage. I'm sure we are too.
Point taken.
I'm sure. And I tell you what, there's something else interesting too that I want to bring up, and then we're going to work back to the animals. I had a guest on last year, early 80s, won the Nobel Prize in game theory, a guy named Robert Aumann, and we got to talking about the Cold War. And he said, and we started talking about, and again, this goes right into your work, started talking about that, to avoid the war, you can't just yell peace. Okay. From his perspective, and this is a mathematical perspective, the game theory perspective, the John Nash perspective was you have to be prepared to fight. And then when you are prepared to fight, when you are at the point where both sides know you're prepared to fight, then there's no war. And he pointed out, he said, 40 years, the USSR and USA had bombers in the sky 24/7 loaded with nukes. And that kept the peace. Now, of course, you and I can immediately say, well, God, that really sucks that we had to do that. But then again, that's our world, right? Isn't it? I mean, you can't put the genie back in the thing again. And so I thought it was interesting but doesn't that parallel right with the animal weapons?
And again, I should just add, it totally does. And I guess I have to add the caveat that, I don't come at this from that perspective. I come at this as a biologist, and I came at this from a family upbringing that is very anti-war. In fact, on one side of my family, going back to the 1600s, they were all Quakers. I mean, I don't come at this from a rah-rah big armies perspective at all. But there I was pouring through the literature, looking at all these stories and animals, and that is exactly the conclusion that I came to as well. And it stunned me. I mean, it really shocked me that there I was as a scientist doing what we do as scientists and connecting the logical dots and drawing the patterns that we infer from the data that we collect. And that was the inescapable conclusion. And there are animal parallels. So
okay, let me give you one animal. Let me let you start with one animal, and then we're going to work back to the beginning with the dung beetles.
Perfect.
Go ahead and talk about the fiddler crab and connect the fiddler crab to the Soviet and USA bombers in the sky 24/7, and they don't have to fight. And the fiddler crab is waving that big old claw, and generally they don't want to fight either, do they?
You got it. So fiddler crabs, I mean, they're the champions in terms of animal weapons. And most people can picture in their head at least roughly what these things look like. But just to put it into scale, these males have sort of two sets of arms or appendages coming off the front of their body. One of them is this little tiny one that they use to feed, and the other one is huge. It's this massive claw that they wave up and down, and that they use in fights. And these claws are packed with muscle, and the males wrestle with these claws. The males invest 100% of their body weight in this weapon. That means they're doubling their body weight. They're producing a full copy of their body and carrying it around as a weapon. And by any metric you want to come up with, that's a staggering proportion of sort of material resources that are allocated to this weapon. So it's relative to body size, it's the biggest weapon of any animal ever. And these males are out there producing these huge claws. They're dragging these things around. These claws are expensive. They cost a lot of energy to make. They're dangerous for these guys to carry. They make them really obvious targets. They slow them down. I mean, imagine running with 150 pounds of gear stuffed in your arms. It slows you down. And so there's a price associated with these things. But these males invest all of this into the weapons because it helps them win fights over access to females. But where you're going with this is that these animals have these huge weapons, but they actually don't fight as often as you think that they would. They have tons of confrontations with rivals. Rival crabs face off in the sand by the thousands any given night on these beaches that are just covered with these crabs. But the males are waving them up and down as a signal. It's like this big billboard saying, I can clobber you. My weapon is bigger. And the males size each other up, and they line up against each other, and they wave their claws, and the guys with the smaller claws walk away. And they walk away for a good reason. It's because the size of the weapon accurately, honestly predicts the likelihood that the male is going to win. A male with a bigger weapon is in better condition, does have more resources able to pour into the conflict. Those are the guys that are most likely to win. And so what happens is all these fights end up getting resolved essentially peacefully, because the males will stand off and they'll wave and they'll bluster, and then the little guy walks away, and there's no fight and there's no injury. Nobody gets killed in the fray. And so there are a couple, you see this to some extent in lots of animals with weapons, that the bigger the weapons get, the more visible they become as a signal, the more honest they become as a signal of fighting ability, the more effectively they function as deterrents. And when you get to the animals like the fiddler crabs with the biggest weapons of all, most of their fights, really most of the contests end up not being battles. They're not dangerous. The other animal that's worth mentioning is the caribou, because caribou have the largest antlers relative to their body size of any vertebrate, of any sort of warm-blooded animal with a skeleton on the inside. And these guys hardly ever fight. One of my favorite studies that I came across pouring through the literature was this study that looked at like 11,000 contests between rival males. Only 6 escalated into knockdown, drag-out battle. So yeah, these are weapons. Antlers are weapons, and they can be used to fight, and the fights can be deadly. But because the antlers make good deterrents, good signals of fighting ability, and because it pays to pay attention to those signals, these animals with the biggest weapons are the most peaceful. They hardly ever fight. So yeah, it was a little scary to extrapolate that to our modern world and to try to come to the conclusion then that sometimes the best way to be safe is to have the most effective, the most expensive, the most state-of-the-art weaponry.
It's counterintuitive.
It is. Now there's problems, right? That works in principle. And it may mean that most of the time you're safe. But even in the animals, if you look closely, there are still situations where the confrontations precipitate out of control. And in those cases, the fights can be really, really bad because these guys are heavily armed. And so we always run that risk too. The idea is that we may be safer on average, and the majority of conflicts may be resolved without fights because we have really effective war-making capabilities and it works as a deterrent. But it doesn't mean that it always works. And if it ever breaks down, then there you are with these sort of stunning weapons and facing the reality of actually having to use them.
Okay, I'm going to get you to pause in the breaks down part on mass destruction weapons, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. But right now, what I want to do first is tell you one more thing about me, and then I want you to define something as we start.
Okay.
Back at my house in Virginia, I actually have a scale replica of a Triceratops skull and a scale replica of a T-Rex skull. So I didn't go as far as you did as a little boy never growing up, but I've
came pretty close, actually. That's awesome.
I've tried to stay close that I have these scale replicas, the price of cars in my house. But anyways, here's where I want you to go. I want you to define out of the gate for people an evolutionary biologist, which is what you are.
Okay. That's not where I thought you were going to go with the Triceratops and the T-Rex skulls.
Well, we could come back to that, but I want you to define. I haven't got you to define you yet first.
Well, yeah, because people have a right to know who is this guy and why is he talking about politics and militaries and things like that. I'm an evolutionary biologist. What that means is I study natural populations of organisms in their elements. So in my case, it's beetles. I've studied a number of different species of beetles. I've studied them in Central America. I've studied them in South America, in Africa, all over the world. And I'm interested in diversity in animal morphology. So for me, that means the weapons. I have a soft spot for these sort of extreme structures, and I study animals that produce things that are sort of outlandish and disproportionate and they make these animals look like they should tip over or trip. And you look at they're like a Triceratops. You look at an animal like that and it's like, how is that possible? Well, as an evolutionary biologist, we study how is that possible. I look at what these traits function for in the wild. And I look at why individuals with, in my case, bigger weapons might perform better or might reproduce more effectively than other individuals with smaller weapons. So we're looking at the forces out there in natural populations that shape the turnover, if you will, among individuals and cause some individuals to succeed more than others. We're interested in why certain subsets of the population do better than others and why populations tend to change over time in the directions that they do. Why do some populations change in a direction where the weapons get bigger and bigger and bigger, and other populations go in a different direction and the weapons disappear? As an evolutionary biologist, we're interested in the diversity. Why do some species have these traits and others not? And we're interested in the processes, the details of the things that unfold on the ground that cause those populations to diverge like that. And nowadays, it's a lot of genetics. I spend a lot of time looking at the genomes of these animals, looking at the developmental mechanisms that cause cells to grow into something like a weapon, and what kinds of physiological pathways and genes direct that development. And then if I want to know why one population has big weapons and another one has small weapons, I can sort of open the hood, if you will, look inside at what's going on in these animals, and we can start to get a sense, we hope to be able to get a sense for what types of mutations to what types of genes actually sort of spontaneously popped up in these populations that caused them to have different weapon shapes or sizes. And those animals then did differentially depending on their weapons. And these are the kinds of sort of historical events that unfolded to give you diversity in weapon form.
Doug,
so I wasn't ready for that question. I don't know if I articulated that clearly, but I'm interested in diversity. I'm interested in how populations change over time, why they change over time. And now we're at the level where we're really interested in the genes, the actual, sort of looking under the hood, the molecular biology processes that are unfolding that permit populations to change over time. In my case, it can be crazy things like animal weapons, but the phenomena that I study are no different than things that modern people studying evolution in medicine are studying. Why is it that a disease changes the way as it does? Why do we have to get flu shots every year? Because the flu virus evolves so rapidly that the vaccines we generate one year are ineffective at matching the strains of the virus that are out there the next year. That is one of the most rapid evolutionary phenomena anywhere. And so the kinds of things I study might be in the rainforest on beetles with horns, but they're actually the same things that people with the CDC are studying left and right to try to figure out where the next disease is going to come from and what direction it's going to evolve.
Pick an example of a particular arms race, an animal weapons arms race in your mind. Pick a fascinating one and lead me through look, I'm a nimble animal right now. I don't have any great armaments, but something starts to happen. So maybe there's a mutation in my brother. And my brother, he's got a little bit bigger something. And then maybe lead me through that process, pick an animal, and how that arms race starts to happen.
All right, I'm going to pick one of my favorite animals. It's one that most people don't spend a lot of their waking hours thinking about. It's the dung beetle. Everybody's heard of dung beetles. Many people have seen dung beetles. Most people haven't really thought about them, and most people are completely unaware of the kinds of weapons that some of these species have. So say you're a beetle, and if you're a male beetle, then everything in your world is about reproduction. I mean, your whole life flashes before your eyes, and whether you make it or not is entirely dependent on whether you're able to fight your way to access to a female. Well, if you happen to be a species of beetle that lives and fights inside a tunnel, and many of the dung beetles do this, right? They fly into cow manure or horse manure, whatever the particular type of dung might be. We study them in Africa. It could be elephant dung. you fly into a pile of elephant dung and you burrow through it. And then beetles tend to do one of two things. Some species carve a hunk of the dung off into a ball. They sculpt it into a sphere and they push it away from everything else as fast as possible. And just to get you into this scene, if you will, there's a lot of competition. You fly into a pile of elephant dung in the Serengeti, and you might have to face 50,000 rival beetles of all these different species that are all piling into this and all trying to carve that up and steal it and use it for themselves and use it to feed their own young. And so there's this intense pile of beetles all competing for this food source. So one way you get around the competition is you carve a ball and you push it away from everybody else as fast as possible. Well, if you do that, you're a male beetle, you carve your ball, you roll away with it, you're not going to get away unscathed. First of all, females are going to find the ball and go with you. That's great. That's like the whole story right there. If you can get a female to follow you with your dung ball, you get away from everybody else. You can mate with the female, bury that food, and everything is golden. Problem is all these other males are going to challenge you, and they're going to pile on top of you and pull at you and try to pull you off that dung pile. They're going to scramble around, and you're going to have 4, 5, 6 different beetles all fighting for this food source as you try to get it away. A different kind of beetle goes into that same elephant dung pile and instead of carving a ball, goes into a tunnel underground. So females of these species excavate burrows like tubes into the soil underneath the dung, and they pull the dung down into the tubes, and that's their way to get away from the competition. Well, if you're that kind of beetle, you go into one of these burrows and you plant yourself at the entrance and you block that entrance and you make sure no other males get in there. And now you've got the female inside the tunnel beneath you, and you're blocking the gate, so to speak, and none of the other rival competitor males can get by. So in both of these cases, you've got males fighting other males to get access to females. But that one difference in behavior makes all the difference in the world. So now say your mutation pops up, your brother or you in this case, and you've got a little knob on your body that's a bit bigger than it was before, something that, sticks out like a little itty bitty horn. Well, if you're fighting in a big scramble, that's not really going to do much. You can't brace yourself very well. There's no way to use that little knob like you would to open the lid on a soda bottle or something like that. You can't use it to pry very well. You're scrambling around out in the open. And if anything, agility is going to matter. And if that little knob you produce is actually pretty expensive, you wouldn't want to be wasting any resources on it because it's not going to do you any good. If that little knob, that mutation arises that makes a knob on a beetle that's inside a tunnel, then everything's different. I mean, basically, they're both dung beetles. They're in the same place. They're fighting over females. They're doing the same thing. But in this case, because you're in a tunnel and because you're blocking the tunnel, a knob like that gives you an edge because now you can block that tunnel better. Another beetle tries to force his way past you, and you've got a hook now, literally like a bottle top opener that you can use to grab onto the edge of his sort of shield, the thorax part of him, and pry him out. And if that knob gets even bigger, you can use it like the bars on a jail cell to literally block off the tunnel so that nobody else can push their way by. So here's a situation where you can push into the sides of the tunnel with your legs and lock yourself in there. And you can use that knob on your head, that horn, to pry or to twist or to block the tunnel. And so in that situation, having a little knob makes a huge difference. And in that particular situation, the males that tend to have the biggest knobs or the biggest horns are the ones that have an edge. And that's some of the stuff that we did and a number of other biologists have done. We've been able to watch tons of fights. And if you're fighting inside a tunnel, the bigger bodied beetle and the beetle with the bigger weapons, those are the guys that win. So males with longer weapons win. So what that means is that animal, because of that knob, has a better shot at protecting the tunnel, a better shot at mating with the female, a better shot at siring lots of offspring because he got access to the female. The next generation of that population, then offspring are going to inherit alleles or whatever it is about the genotypes of these animals that cause there to be that little knob. And that's going to be a little bit more common in the population than it was before. And those kids are going to do really well because they've got the bottle top opener. So when they get into fights, they do better than animals without that. And the next generation, their progeny are going to be even more numerous. And the next generation after that. And pretty soon, the population evolves. It turns over so that everybody now has that little knob. And now, say somebody comes up with a mutation that has an even bigger one. So now everybody's got a knob of some sort, but some of these males have really big ones those guys win over the ones with the smaller ones. Their kids are the ones that are the most numerous, and then their kids, and then their kids. And then very quickly the population moves, it sort of ratchets up a notch till the weapon's a little bit bigger.
I think of something else that comes up in the human population. And being in my mid-40s, I'm old enough to have watched the maturation of all the pro sports leagues, etc. And you don't need much of a pulse to be able to recognize names, and the number, I don't care whether you're white or black or what sport you're in, but the number of guys that were pro athletes when I was a teenager, my early 20s, that now are starting to have kids that are superstars as pro athletes. You know, look, there's nurture, there's nature. Not everybody's, not Michael Jordan, not every one of his sons has become the next Michael Jordan, but clearly there's something at play, and we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it.
I didn't prep for this, and I'll get the details wrong, but there is. So there's a number. I mean, so studies of human genetics are just, they're incredible these days. They're moving spectacularly rapidly, and we have more genomics resources for sort of understanding things at a genetic level in humans now than for anything else out there, for obvious and good reasons. And so what people are doing is they're scouring through the genome looking for, you know, mutations and variations in particular alleles of particular genes that seem to correlate with disease traits or with other types of traits that people are interested in. And they begin by trying to sort of form an association. They look for sort of a statistical match between a particular variant of a gene and being a really good athlete, for example, or having a propensity to a certain disease. And once they start making these associations, then the geneticists and again, evolutionary biologists can zoom in and start looking in mice and in other model systems. What happens if we perturb this gene? Do we change the traits that we care about? And they can start to come up with functional links between particular genes and particular traits. And I'm not going to remember the names of the genes in this case, but yes, there are studies now that are showing that there are particular variants of certain genes that affect the way your cells use oxygen, that make you more efficient. So for the same amount of circumstance or the same amount of air, some individuals are more efficient at using that oxygen than others. There are alleles that affect muscle properties. There are actually logical genetic underpinnings to why some people have really, really good athletic performance. And you know, it's not as simple as that, right? I mean, the kinds of things that make a sprinter are different from the kinds of things that make a marathon runner. And you look at a football field and you look at the body size and the muscle build and the differences among individuals. A lot of that is not inheritance of particular alleles. It's training and it's diet and it's other things that people do. But you can see pretty quickly that there are different types of traits that are specialized for or that perform especially well for particular functions, whether you're a running back or an offensive lineman. And again, some of that is going to be driven by training and by diet, but a lot of that, I think we're realizing the kinds of sort of predispositions to be really small and light and fast, or to be really big and bulky and wide, those kinds of things I won't be surprised at all if we can start to find really clear genetic underpinnings for. So no, there are loads of things you can start to look at in people where we can start to figure out, at least at some level, what genetic variation sort of predisposes people. But I want to be clear about something. If you're going to, that's again, this is, I'm going the directions you're taking me here, and that wasn't.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm just wandering around the playing field. I'm just looking under the hood and seeing what's there. What do you mean? I'm not leading you anywhere.
No, I didn't mean it that way. I just meant that I would have done my homework and I would have actually had the names of the genes in question.
Okay, listen. Okay, here's where I want to go next. Okay, so
I want to make one thing clear though. What we're finding, it's not as simple as saying, oh, I have a gene for this trait, and therefore I'm going to have this disease, or I'm going to be, an incredible athlete. What we're learning is that the interesting biology is at the interface of genes and the environment. It's the way that particular alleles in your genome interact with the diet choices you make or the lifestyle choices you make. There's actually an interaction between those two. And so what happens is you might inherit an allele. You might have a very strong family history for cancer or for alcoholism. It doesn't mean you're going to be an alcoholic or you're going to get cancer, because there isn't a gene for this. But what it means is, because of the alleles you inherit, if you were to line up 100 people and expose them to the same sets of environmental circumstances, some of them, maybe you, because of the allele you inherit, are going to be more likely to develop cancer in response to those situations than others. So there's sort of an inherited predisposition or a propensity towards a particular condition like cancer or alcoholism. If you don't drink, you can't become an alcoholic. But You line up 100 people and you give them the same sort of alcohol regimen, and not all of them are going to become alcoholics. Some of them are. And we can start to explain why some people have sort of an inherited predisposition that makes them more likely or more prone than others. So yeah, there's some very exciting genetic studies coming out there, but it's important to put them in context and understand that it doesn't mean that there's a gene for the trait and, I inherit this allele, I'm screwed. But it does mean that you might want to change your behavior. You might want to be aware that in my case, it's heart disease. I have a family history of heart issues. Knowing that helps me make different diet choices than I would otherwise. And it helps me exercise more than I otherwise would. It makes it a higher priority for me because I know that I have an inherited predisposition towards things. So that's the way to think about it. And it can be transformative and constructive.
Clarification well taken. Okay, so here's where I want to take you back to.
Let's go back to Beatles.
I'm going to take you away from Beatles for a second to something a little more sexy.
Wait a minute.
Listen. I can't convince you that Beatles aren't sexy. I know how much time you spent with Beatles. Okay, I understand.
Beatles are the Triceratops of the insect world, and you told me you love Triceratops. So.
Go with me for a second. So we've talked about the arms race and how an arms race can happen in the beetle population. But then eventually something like an arms race, as you state, it can run its course. And I think it'd be an interesting example because this was one of my favorite animals as a kid. And not until I was an adult, and frankly, not until I started doing this podcast, am I going back and reading about, I think it was the technical name would be Smilodon. Would that be correct? So I going back and understanding that big old saber-toothed cat that I thought was so cool when I was a kid was kind of, not a sleek body, not a big runner, and was a guy that basically his front two teeth had gotten so long, he just hung out in a tree and wait for a mastodon to come by, right? Explain how an arms race can start to run its course with something like the saber-toothed cat.
Okay. Yes. So in the situation I set up with the beetles, and that's relevant to the fiddler crabs and it's relevant to caribou, these are situations where the weapons are borne by the males, and the males are using them in battles over access to females. So the context or the backdrop for all of this is competition over access to reproduction. That's the currency that matters. And so the weapons tend to only be in the males, and they get used in this certain type of a contest. And that is the most common sort of natural scenario that leads to extraordinarily rapid arms race evolution of ridiculous weapon sizes. Sexual selection is what it's called when males compete for access to females, or when members of one sex, it can go the other way around. Members of one sex, male or female, compete for access to the other. That's sort of the most pervasive, most widespread phenomenon that tends to lead to extravagance and to the evolution of these things that are absurd. But as you point out, Smilodon, so the saber-tooths, are another. And that's not a situation, the big canine teeth in these guys, and they're amazing. And you said you have a Triceratops in your house. I have a life-size replica of a Smilodon or a saber-tooth skull on my desk in my office. I love it. I walked into that assuming, of course, it works like all these other weapons. Surely those big teeth are just in the males, not in the females. And surely it has to do with fighting over access to females. I was wrong. That's not true. And at first I didn't believe it. I was going through the literature like, this can't be right. How come they're not talking about sexual selection? How come they're not talking about male competition? And I finally had to contact some of the paleontologists, and they're like, no, you're wrong. Everybody had the big teeth. Males had the big teeth. Females had the big teeth. These were not structures used in competition for access to reproduction. They're used by predators. And that actually threw me for a loop, because when you look at predators, most predators don't have really big weapons, and it's for a pretty obvious reason. They slow you down. They get really awkward, and you can't run fast, or if you're a fish, you can't swim fast, or if you're a bird, you can't fly fast. You can't move fast if you're carrying this big, clunky, awkward weapon around. And so if you're a predator, that's usually the end. I mean, if you can't catch your food, it doesn't really matter how big your weapons are. And so the interesting thing that the Smilodon, where it's sort of this thorn in my side. It's like, here's this animal with an incredible weapon, and it just didn't fit the pattern. And for me, it was one of those epiphanies when all the pieces finally clicked into place. And I was reading this paper paper about the saber-tooths, coming at all the specimens they'd gotten in the La Brea tar pits, and they're talking about what they think these animals did. And you hit it on the head. These guys were not able to run fast. They were awkward. They were thick and heavy and gangly. And if you think about their faces, they couldn't have run fast. Their heads are squashed backwards. So these teeth sort of project forward. They can't even look at where they're going. So these are clumsy animals. And these people in this little paragraph in this paper say, well, we think they were ambush predators. And that was it. That was like, boom, everything clicked into place. And I started realizing, my God, an ambush predator, they don't have to run fast. They're not a cheetah. They don't have to chase down prey. They sit there and they wait for the prey to come to them. And that's a fundamentally different hunting strategy. But as soon as you do that, you change the game, because all of a sudden it doesn't matter if you're awkward or you're gangly. What matters is, can you catch that prey really quickly? And in a lot of these situations, big weapons are better. And so in the case of the saber-tooth, they think that these guys hung out on trees. They hung out up in trees and they dropped from trees onto unsuspecting prey. And the best guess, as far as I know, is sort of lumbering juvenile mastodons and mammoths. So you've got your little baby elephant walking by, and all of a sudden this thing with like 10-inch daggers drops out of the tree, plunges those things into the back of the neck, and kills the prey. They don't have to run. They're not a cheetah. All they have to do is drop onto their unsuspecting prey. And so once that sort of piece to the puzzle clicked and I started looking around, I realized this is true everywhere. My kids love Finding Nemo. Remember the viper fish in Finding Nemo with this? It's just basically a mouth with huge teeth that was down in the deep sea. That was a cartoon character, but it's a caricature of true to life viperfish and anglerfish. There's a whole suite of these deep sea monsters. They're ambush predators. They use little dangling globs of light as a lure to pull the prey into them. They don't have to swim fast. These aren't tuna. These things sit there and they wait till the prey come to them, and then boom, they grab them with these massive jaws. You see the same thing with alligator gar with these long jaws. You see it with praying mantids. So yeah, you hit on something there. There is a whole separate context out there in nature that can lead to the evolution of extreme weapons. And it's when predators that presumably used to be the traditional run them down, chase them down predators change their behavior, and they start adopting a sit and wait or an ambush tactic.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of another example to throw at you about just something from my world that I think parallels with this notion of an arms race. And if I look at the trading world, for example, so all the rage right now is for people to have faster and faster trading. So I don't know, they want to trade the speed of light. So it all becomes very resource dependent. I mean, servers on top of servers, you have to get closer. There's been a lot of books about this. You have to get closer to the exchanges, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's one way to think about it. And there's a huge arms race there. However, there is a very,
I never thought about that.
There's a very sizable population of extremely successful traders that go just the opposite direction. They maybe trade what we call a weekly bar. So they trade one day, the closing price of the stock market once a week. And they only make their decisions off the closing price of the stock market once a week. So all these other guys are out there trying to trade at the speed of light because they think the faster they can get ahead of everybody. And there's other people that are saying, hey, hold on. We don't want to have all those resources. We don't want to have.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
I'm making an instant prediction based on what you're saying. These people that take that plan B, they don't play by the rules. They're not investing everything in these really fast servers. Are they saving?
You already
resources?
know.
Are they? I mean, are they?
You already know who wins.
Some staggering price.
Here's the thing. Look, the high frequency guys, the ones that have got the rigged game, of course they're making money. Okay, but it's kind of like a rigged kind of thing, and who knows if that lasts, right? Maybe that's something for right now. But you're thinking right that the people that are using less resources are a little more nimble, and maybe their quality of life is different. But yeah, the people that kind of look at less data and a longer time horizon can do just as well, if not better, and they don't have to stay in that arms race of the fastest servers and the fastest connections and all that kind of stuff.
I love it. I've never thought about that example. I love it. And it's a perfect fit. This is exactly what you see in animals. So you get the biggest males that are investing just obscene amounts of resources in these weapons. And for the biggest of the big, the males with the biggest weapons, it's worth it because they win and they are able to get access to the females, and they might get access to lots of females, and all that time, that means there's all these other males that aren't getting anything at all. So to the victor go the spoils, in a sense. And if you can play that game with the best resources and the biggest weapons and win, you do really well. But these males are investing enormous resources in these things. And so if you look at some of the studies on antlers and elk or you know, in the deer family, these guys are leaching so much calcium and phosphorus in order to make the antlers that they're pulling it out of their own skeletons, and they're going through this sort of brittle boned seasonal form of osteoporosis just so that they can shunt everything into the production of the weapons. I mean, they're literally, it's deficit spending. They're depleting their own reserves that they need to survive to make these weapons. And you look at some of the beetles, and they're putting so much into these weapons that they're stunting their eyes, and their wings are smaller, and their testes are smaller. So they're like, you know, they're doing all this so they can mate, and then they can't even produce as much sperm because they had to shunt resources away from their testes to make these big weapons. So you're paying this huge price. And so what do you do if you're not the biggest male in the game? You know, you can pour all these resources into this expensive technology, so to speak, the weapons, but you're not going to win. Go the opposite way. And that's what they do. They ditch it. They stop producing the weapons. They shunt everything into something else, and they adopt a plan B. They sneak. They do something else and break the rules.
Go to the octopus example with the color changing and the smaller octopus male that gets around these limitations that we're talking about of the alpha. And still the octopus is not the alpha, but he's figured out a way around the system.
Yeah. So this, all right. I love this story. So first, just to connect the dots though, the beetles that we just talked about, you're in the tunnel, you're a big beetle, you've got huge weapons, you're fighting to block the tunnel. What happens in the beetles is there's little males that don't even produce the horns at all. They've got really big testes, really big genitalia. They are good dispersers. And instead of fighting, they dig a little side tunnel and they mine their way in underground, and they're able to get around the big guy guarding the gate. And they can get into the tunnel beneath them by mining their way in, and then they can mate with the female on the sly. So they're not producing weapons, they're not fighting, they're not investing in armaments or fighting or any of that stuff, and they sneak around and do an end game and they get in. So the one you're mentioning is one of the slickest of these, and it's related to the octopus, but it's the cuttlefish actually. And what they do, these guys they're really quick at changing their body color. So they can go up against sort of rocks on the bottom of the ocean and change in a second or two and match that pattern so that they just blend, they vanish into the background because they're so good at hiding, and they're sort of mimicking the stippling pattern and all the colors of the pebbles and the gravel and the stuff beneath them. And so these are animals that have extraordinary abilities to change color. And so what you're getting at is in the mating season. And again, this isn't my work. This is just an incredible literature that's out of people like Roger Hanlon that have done this stuff. But what they find is that these cuttlefish, the big males, during the breeding season, they turn into something that's the underwater equivalent of a peacock. They produce beautiful purples and greens and this rich sort of tapestry of color on their bodies that's this big display to attract females. Well, if you're a little guy, you're not able to produce as big or as bright a display. You're not going to win at that game. You're not as attractive as the biggest, sexiest guys out there. What do? So they cheat. And what they'll do is they'll mimic a female. They'll put on a color pattern that makes them look like a female. And then they can swim right up to that big displaying male. The big guy's up there with his billboard, and he's got a female right next to him that he's mating with. The little guy, by pretending to be a female, can get right up to that big male. He's not going to challenge him or push him away because he looks like a female. He can get right up in there, and he can actually sidle his way, wiggle his way in between the male and the female while they're courting. And then as soon as he gets in there, he's slid right in there so that he's in between the big male and the female. He changes his color again. And on the side of his body where the male can see him, he still looks like a female. But the other side of his body, the side of his body that the female can see, he changes into a really bright colored male display. So he's like a two-toned animal, and the female looks and sees another male. The male that he's literally right up against looks and sees a female, and he's able to slide in there and mate with the female on the sly by cheating, essentially, by breaking the rules and by playing around with color in a really clever way.
You know, if you bring that back to my example, I was talking about trading, it's the creativity and the industriousness to say, okay, even though maybe the deck is stacked against me, there's a workaround. And that's exactly what you're talking about, the cuttlefish. There's a workaround. The deck, I mean, because you hear all these people in life, they say, oh, the deck's stacked against me. I didn't inherit Shaquille O'Neal's gene pool. I can't do this. I can't do that. There's always a workaround if you want to spend the time, right?
Yeah. And that's how it works in most animal populations too. You know, there are a small subset of individuals that have it all. They're born into wealth, so to speak. They've got really healthy, dominant parents, that they're born with better immune systems, better access to nutrition, better territories. Everything is stacked in their favor. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the animals in these populations give up. They find workarounds, and there are so many neat examples of workarounds. You asked at the beginning, I'm an evolutionary biologist. What do I do? Well, one of the things that's really fun to do as an evolutionary biologist is to look at all the ways that animals have solved this problem and to figure out the kinds of crazy, quirky workarounds that these animal populations have stumbled on, because there's some fun ones, like the cuttlefish. I mean, how cool is that?
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, it's crazy. The parallels are crazy because I caught something in an article where you got some good bit of press somewhere, and I caught it, and I reached out to you, and I was like, I had not read your book, I had not bought your book yet, and then I started going through it. I'm like, man, this is crazy. The parallels are just. It just jumps off the page if you're like, wow, you're forced to. I mean, I'm thinking movies somewhere. I don't know. But, okay. I've only got you for a little bit more here.
Sure.
Let's wind down to the arms race and two things that I want to put in people's head to think about. For example, battleships. Battleships. There's no need for a battleship, or there hasn't been for a long time, but they looked great. You can think about the British Empire, trying to manage, was it 25% of the world's population? It becomes unmanageable. But where I wanted to, just getting people to think about some of the topic areas that you go into. We can't go into everything today, but the last thing I wanted to end with was going back to what we started with, was basically how they call it in war games, thermonuclear war, whatever it is. Okay, so the way that it worked during the Cold War, you had two powers in a nuclear détente. Okay. So, but what happens, and you kind of hint about this in your book, what happens if there's more than two actors, there's 5 actors, there's 10 actors, and then let's say that those actors don't all have the same cultures and the same understandings. In hindsight, the leaders in Moscow and the leaders in Washington, D.C. probably had very similar outlooks to some degree. But what happens if nukes are the final toy to be used and there's no coming back? What happens if too many actors have nukes? And I think I know where you ultimately are going to go with that thought. And I think it's hard for people to disagree that there's probably going to be a point in time where something bad happens.
Yes, it's a fairly scary conclusion when you follow the logical train that I set up in this book. And so I'm trying to think how to do it quickly and how to get where you want to go.
You can talk as long as you want.
Oh, I can, because you brought up a bunch of things.
Go ahead.
First of all, just to make the point, again, I come at this from biology. What I did is I stepped back from having worked on beetles, and I went through the literature, and I started looking at examples of arms races in lots of different kinds of animals, in everything I could find. And I did it, first of all, because I wanted to tell the stories of these crazy, these are wonderful, amazing, bizarre animals. They look like freaks of nature. And I like that. I wanted to understand what makes them tick and why they look and act the way that they do. While doing that, it became increasingly clear that whether I was talking about a little moose fly in New Guinea or a mastodon, the stories were the same, that these animals were incredibly different in every aspect I could think of their life, where they lived, what they ate, how big they were. Everything they did was different except for the weapons. They all had huge weapons. And the more I looked, the more I realized they all had these weapons for the same reasons. So the same kinds of circumstances, the stars had to align in exactly the same way in order for these populations to launch into an arms race. And so once I started realizing there is sort of a common theme, there's a core set of criteria that can trigger an arms race, then I started looking much more closely at the arms race phenomenon. What happens once it begins? How does it unfold? Why do they end? And all of these things turned out to be parallel across these species too. Around the same time, my editors are like, hey, you got to look at human weapons too. And my first reaction is, no way, I'm a biologist. But they kept saying, no, I think there's something here. Dig a little deeper and look. And I started reading the military literature. And that's when I started getting really blown away, because I realized that there are everything that was sort of a common element that could explain an arms race in an animal also applied when we started looking at our own military technologies. And that was the sort of realization that took this book to the next level and took me to the next level. And I started going crazy, pulling all these things together and trying to look for parallels and trying to figure out what starts arms races in our military traditions. Is it the same kinds of conditions? And once the arms races start, are they going to unfold in the same way? And when they collapse, are they going to collapse in the same way? And the answer I kept coming back to is yes, it's exactly the same. And then right around the time I was starting to get excited, but I was still nervous because I'm not a military historian, I stumbled on the work of a military historian, Robert O'Connell, who writes, in my opinion, brilliant sort of analyses of military history, who's gone into arms races and asked exactly the same questions, and he'd come to almost exactly the same conclusions. So here's a military guy with specialties in arms races and military who's looking at biology for parallels. And I'm a biologist looking at the military for parallels. And we're meeting in the middle and coming to astonishingly similar conclusions. And that's when I realized, my God, this is real. And so I started running with that. And what this book is sort of portraying how this process unfolds and trying to set up these parallels. You mentioned battleships. So battleships are relevant for lots of reasons. But one of them is the thing that starts the arms race, this kind of one-on-one interaction, turns out to be, I haven't really talked about it here, but that one of the things that's this crucial prerequisite for the competition type, not the predator arms races, but the male-male competition, the battle type arms races, is a duel, a one-on-one confrontation between rivals that unfolds in a very predictable fashion. And that predictability is essential, because that's what makes it cost effective to invest in weapons. If the male with the bigger weapons really is going to win, then you, by God, want to have the biggest weapons. If the fights aren't predictable, if there's a huge stochastic component to it, then it's not worth spending a lot to build a weapon because it might not matter. It might not determine the outcome. And so explaining arms races meant explaining what are the circumstances where the outcome of fights become the most predictable. And once you could identify that, you could explain when weapons got big in animals, and you could explain when weapons got really extravagant in people. The problem is, and you sort of touched on it, is that the crucial condition that makes these expensive weapons worthwhile is this predictable outcome, this sort of one-on-one contest. And when you start getting 3, 4, 5, 6 different animals in the fray, everything starts to break down. It gets really chaotic and really unpredictable and really dangerous. And so the dung beetles, where they carve the balls and they're all wrestling and tussling around on the surface, those fights aren't predictable. It's not worth having a weapon. And none of the ball-rolling dung beetles ever have weapons. Only inside the tunnel, where the males fight one-on-one. In a tunnel, you have to fight one-on-one, because you have to crawl into the tunnel to confront a rival, and only one rival can fit in the tunnel at a time. And you got to walk into the tunnel so you face your opponent face to face, one-on-one in a duel. So being in a tunnel makes it predictable and consistent, and that can lead to arms races. So when you start talking about big weapons in politics and landscapes, if you've got a duel like the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States locked head-to-head, that's a one-on-one showdown. That's a predictable type of escalation that's just like what we see in animals. When you start getting a whole lot of other states in the game, the numbers of degrees of freedom, the ways that this thing can play out become sort of astronomically complex. And one of the conclusions you come to is the really big weapons aren't cost effective. They're not worth it in that kind of contest. It's too dangerous and it's too unpredictable. That sort of safety factor that you get from deterrence won't work when it's too complicated. And there's one last thing. I know I'm rambling for a while here, but one more point I want to make on that. One of the other things that comes out of this parallel, this logic, is that, you know, this thing that you talked with me about a little bit earlier today, why are we safer with big weapons? Well, we're safer with big weapons if those really big weapons are honest signals of who's likely to win a fight, and if we're sort of in a one-on-one showdown with a rival who has similar armaments that are also really big and really effective. In that situation, it doesn't pay either side to escalate into battle, because we both know we'll lose. That mutually assured destruction phenomenon is real, and it can lead to a stalemate, and it can lead to peace. But it requires the biggest, most deadly weapons also being so astonishingly expensive that only the superpowers can afford them. That's the reason there's only two facing it. They're the only states out there that can afford to play that game. And that's what keeps it simple, and that's what keeps it predictable. The things that we're facing now aren't like that, because the weapons of mass destruction that were those state-of-the-art, astronomically expensive weapons during the Cold War aren't now. There's tons of nuclear weapons out there that are rotting away in storage sheds, or that are, you know, and we have biological weapons now that are really dangerous that you can build for a couple grand in a basement. And so the weapons with the most killing power aren't the most expensive now. Lots and lots of
Let me
organizations.
interject one that I think, just to play devil's advocate for a second.
That makes it very scary, because now it's a one-on-one showdown. It's not predictable.
But
Deterrence shouldn't work.
Here's an interesting one that I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of the average Ukrainian today. So I believe in the early 90s, Ukraine had the third biggest stockpile of nukes, right? And so the USSR breaks up. They've got the third biggest stockpile. And the deal essentially was, okay, give up all your nukes. You know, basically NATO will protect you, or we won't let anything happen. And so Ukraine gives up their trump card, so to speak, and then boom. I mean, I can't think there's any state actor right now that will ever believe, after watching what happened in Ukraine, they will never believe on a state actor at that level that a nuke is not a deterrent. They won't believe it.
But how is a deterrent when too many players on the stage start having these things? I mean, again, if we're going to take lessons from animals, deterrence only works in very specific situations. And they're ones where the outcomes are very predictable. And that predictability comes from these sort of one-on-one showdown matchups. And in a landscape where a dozen or 24 nations have weapons of mass destruction of one sort or another, deterrent shouldn't work in that kind of situation.
Okay, but if we put ourselves in the leadership of Ukraine, and they give up their nukes, and they're told they're going to have protection.
I hear you.
Nobody's going to ever believe. No state is ever going to believe if I give up my nukes. And of course, I mean, look, it's insane. The whole thing's insane.
This is the problem. So any state looking at itself, which is what states have to do, is going to come to the inescapable conclusion that they're going to be safer with these types of weapons of mass destruction than without. For the logic that you're referring to, nobody's going to screw with us because the consequences are too dire.
Yeah.
Fine. But when you get too many states that make that independent assessment and that then ratchet up to that level, the collective effect on the global landscape is pandemonium. I mean, it's unpredictable. It's not a one-on-one showdown the way we had in the Cold War. It's a much more complex,
it's something different
thing, and that's where I am so out of my element. I'm a biologist again. I mean, let's not forget I work on beetles, but that's where the logic that made so much sense, that brought so much clarity to understanding our past by looking at animals, that logic begins to dissolve. And I ended up no longer being comfortable making predictions about where we are today, because the landscape that we're sitting on today literally scared the daylights out of me. I mean, if I'm going to draw conclusions from the animals, the conclusion is, wow, this is a spectacularly dangerous situation that we're in, partly because it's a more complicated landscape without that predictability of a one-on-one showdown, and partly because the technologies, the legacy of the Cold War, like it or not, are weapons with a capacity to kill on a scale that's unprecedented. There are no animals with weapons of mass destruction like that. There are no animal parallels of a weapon that is so dangerous it can't really ever be used anywhere. I mean, we just don't have examples of that in the animal world. And so once you raise the stakes that high, you're getting to a point where these weapons are so dangerous, they really can't be used ever, anywhere. And there is no precedent. I mean, again, I mentioned things like fiddler crab claws and caribou antlers. These make great deterrents. And in the caribou 11,000 contests, only 6 escalated to full battle. But you know what? 6 of them did escalate to full battle. These things still do function as weapons occasionally. And we're talking about technologies that we've inherited now that are so bad that we can't let that ever happen. And there is no precedent for that in nature. It never happens in nature. They always get used at some point. And that's, I guess, where I start getting the chills up my spine, start getting scared.
It's funny. I don't necessarily get the chills. But not because I don't think it will happen. I think the chances are, maybe not in our lifetime, but the chances are at some point in time, if too many state actors have nukes and some of those state actors are not as well funded or this or that, something's going to happen. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if somebody could do 9/11, they can, I mean, look, if they had a suitcase nuke on 9/11 and they had it in New York City, they would have used it. They would have used it. Of course they would have used it. Why not? That's the way they were thinking.
You're not helping me feel better here.
How can
So Where are you going with this? You're right. You're exactly right. This is why I'm scared. Because if you take something like that, that to put that into context, that's a sneak strategy. We talk about sneaky male beetles getting in around the big fighting male. With a superpower like the United States, with the conventional arsenals that we have, the options that are on the table for most of our opponents are the little sneaky male strategies. They break the rules. They do something unexpected and unorthodox, and they don't fight us fair fights on a level playing field. And when you start taking sneaky strategies like that, they happen in every animal system out there. They've all got sneaky males of some kind or another. That makes perfect sense. But it doesn't really affect the integrity or the profitability, if you will, of the armaments of the big males, because it still pays to be the biggest male most of the time. But if the sneaky males start doing too well, if they start stealing too many of the matings, then you run into this point where all of a sudden these big guys are producing these big expensive weapons and they're shunting tons of resources into it. And then instead of getting a return on their investment, their return is being eroded by these sneaky parasitic guys that are sneaking in and breaking the rules and cheating and pulling away all the benefits. And so they're not paying the cost. So these big guys are paying this cost and they're no longer getting the benefits. You reach this point where an arms race can collapse because it's just not worth it anymore, because the sneaking strategies do too well. So most of the time, the little sneaky strategies they're not that effective. Yeah, they can do harm, but they're not going to completely topple the regime or win in an outright sort of black and white sense of the word. They're just there being a hassle. But if you start getting sneaky strategies with weapons of mass destruction, if you're talking a suitcase bomber with a suitcase nuke, now you're changing the stakes here. You're talking about sneaky strategies with the potential to inflict catastrophic damage. And again, there is no in the animal world, that would collapse an arms race. Is done. It's like it's not worth having big weapons anymore because they're not going to help you anymore. But I don't know that you can make that parallel and extend that logic. I
would start doing yoga and meditation, because it's not worth worrying about something that will surely happen at some point in time.
But I will tell you that as an evolutionary biologist, it's been a pretty wild ride. It's fun starting to look at the landscape around us today. And I like history, starting to look at the past and thinking about it in this new light.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
I want to end on a high note. That's an intellectually rewarding and stimulating exercise. It's a great way to sort of improve our understanding of the natural world. I live in Montana. I've got elk behind my house, and we've got, I live surrounded by animals with crazy weapons. And a lot of that diversity makes more sense now. And I love history. And so reading the history, a lot of the arms races in the past make more sense now. So the parallels are really rewarding. It's just when we start getting to where we are today that we're dealing with a landscape that has no precedent, where things start getting both scary and really unpredictable.
I'll give you a high note change of subject. So I was jotting a last note down here about my world, and I was thinking to myself, okay, there's no guarantee that all the expensive resources that can give you perhaps a predictable, short-term, high-frequency trading advantage, there's no guarantee that all that stuff's going to work. But less money spent and that nimbleness sounds a heck of a lot more interesting to me. I love nimble. Nimble should be the topic of our conversation. I mean, I just love nimble. The idea of being nimble, I'd rather be a nimble character as a human being in this world right now than stuck. Now, I'm just talking from myself standpoint.
It's so funny. I mean, I study all these animals with these monstrous weapons, and we all like to identify with the biggest bucks with the biggest racks of antlers on their heads. But, most of us don't fit that bill. And I'm probably more of the sneaky male strategy myself, I suppose. Nimble is good. I'll agree with you.
Hey, listen, Doug, it's been fun chatting. Where can we send people? The book is on Amazon. I know, because I just bought it.
It's also through Henry Holt and Macmillan. They have a page. It's called Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle.
Where can people find out more about you online? You've got a bunch of stuff online. You've got a lab online, all kinds of stuff.
I'm a biology professor at the University of Montana, so I have a research page and a faculty page that's really easy to find. I don't know if we have a Wikipedia page yet, but we may have one soon. But again, the other way to find me is just to search for Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle, and there's an author page and there's information there. Now, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for chatting.
Thanks for it's one of my most unique podcasts yet, I'm sure. Thanks,
I hadn't seen the parallels with trading until you brought it up, but I think there's a pretty cool parallel there.
Yeah,
I had never thought of before. So thank you for that.
Hey, take care, man. We'll talk again, hopefully in the future.
All right, you too. Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.